Okay, today we are picking up in Acts chapter 8, verse 5. And we are picking up in the section that now transitions to Philip. Remember, we had talked before about three people that Luke deals with in Acts. And we saw in Acts chapter 6, remember, we talked about how there were three panels, as it were, in Acts, starting with Acts chapter 6, verse 8, where it starts off where it says, "And Stephen." And from Acts chapter 6, 8, through Acts 8, 4, what we have is we have the account of Stephen, where we have his ministry, his message, and his martyrdom. And then in Acts 8:5, we have a transition to where now Luke gives us this account of Philip. And that runs through the end of Acts chapter 8. And then in Acts chapter 9, verse 1, it says now Saul. And so then we're going to transition and we're going to deal with the person of Saul. So we're dealing with these three people that Luke gives us specific accounts about. Now, last time we left off with what? We left off with the martyrdom of Stephen. He delivers this beautiful, theologically rich message. Remember, he's standing alone. He's a believer by himself. He's standing in front of the Sanhedrin and this council, this synagogue of what was called the freedmen, who were leveling false accusations against him, and he delivers this theologically rich message. And what's the outcome? How do they meet him? Do they meet him with a good reasoned response? Do they meet him with humility? No. They meet him with hostility. They put their hands over their ears. They begin to shout. They meet him with force. They drag him outside the city and they stone him to death. And of course his response is that when they had driven him out of the city in Acts 7:58, they began stoning him, and the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And so there we have the first mention of Saul. And they went on stoning Stephen as he called on the Lord and said, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And having said this, he fell asleep. A euphemism for death, but a picture of rest. Again, it seems somewhat out of place in the face of such violent hostility. Men who were throwing stones that would have been breaking bone and tearing flesh, and just, again, quite a difficult picture to imagine. And then we have Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And then it says in Acts 8:1 that on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house and dragging off men and women, and he would put them in prison. Acts 8:4, therefore those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. And this was a result of the persecution. Remember, I made the comment before that the church in Jerusalem really wasn't missionary-minded. I mean, it's not like they sat down and they planned a missionary activity, that they had some sort of evangelism training. I mean, none of that was their mindset. They had no intention of going out. The only reason they went out was because of the persecution. And once the persecution happened, they were driven out. And in being driven out, they went out and began to share the gospel.